Welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about a topic that is appropriate for this season, and that is Christmas music. So, a little bit of context. I am not a religious person. However, I love Christmas music. I think that sort of appreciation started when I was very young. Obviously, because Christmas is the season where you get gifts, but also because we always would go visit my grandparents who lived in New Jersey. We would stay at their house for about a week surrounding the Christmas holiday, and they had a record player. Probably the first record player I was ever exposed to. It was one of those like 1960s cabinet units, maybe even 50s, probably 60s cabinet units. And they would always play Christmas music throughout the week that we were there. Almost any given time of day, there'd be a record playing. This particular unit that they had was like stacked records. And so they would sort of lift up and play whatever was the one on the bottom. And so it really would just continue for an extended period of time. And a lot of the music that they would play would be things like Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, etc. Right? That sort of like pop vocal Christmas thing that was so popular in the 50s and 60s. They would also play Ferrante and Teicher. They would play a number of different things. Also, I'm trying to think who the band might have been. I don't know if anybody out there is familiar with a choir group called the 16. They sort of play or sing, because there's no instruments. They sing sort of old world music. Almost sounds like sort of what you might expect 1800s Christmas music to sound like. They would do a lot of sort of very religious tunes, a lot of classics. That sort of purely choir Christmas music is great, and that would be the sort of stuff that would play throughout the house as well. So I think that all of that experience sort of advised my appreciation for Christmas music, even though I'm not a religious person. So today I wanted to cover, I think, about a dozen albums that I think are particularly great, which I own copies of. It's a mixture of jazz as well as some is jazz adjacent, some is just outright sort of that older pop, or in some cases soul sort of Christmas thing. So this is not exclusively jazz, but it is mostly jazz. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The first one that I wanted to talk about is going to be probably the most obvious choice out of any of the ones that I'm going to cover, and that is this one by Bing Crosby. So the album is titled Merry Christmas. This particular album came out in 1955 on Decca, and actually I'm going to work my way forward, starting with the earliest. So this is the earliest one we're going to cover. On this album, Bing Crosby is joined by the Andrews Sisters on several tracks. There's also two orchestras that are represented here that he works with. One is the John Scott Trotter Orchestra, and the other is the Vic Schoen Orchestra. So he works with both orchestras. There's sort of mixed formats across these tracks, but this is just classic stuff, right? For me, Bing Crosby, any Christmas song that he sings is the definitive version. I'm sorry to Dean Martin. I'm sorry to Frank Sinatra and so many others who have recorded Christmas music, but for me, this stuff is the best. And a lot of that is because of my association between Bing Crosby and the film White Christmas. So the track White Christmas is indeed included on here. Interestingly, let me talk a little bit, I guess, about the history of that particular track. So while the version of White Christmas that is on this album is indeed great, the song was originally recorded by Bing Crosby in 1941. It was, I believe, put out on radio on Christmas Day, 1941. It was several weeks after the Pearl Harbor attack. So that was the first time that the music was sort of put out there for folks to hear. It was later included in the soundtrack to a movie called Holiday Inn in 1942. So this was the first time that White Christmas was included in the soundtrack on a film, and it wouldn't appear on the White Christmas movie soundtrack or in that movie until 1954. So the song had already become popular by the time it was included in the movie White Christmas. The version included on Holiday Inn actually is not the one that you're likely to hear anymore. And the reason why is because that original track, the original masters, were destroyed, just because it was recorded or sort of used so many different times. And so they ended up re-recording it in 1947 with the same orchestra in an attempt for it to sort of sound the same. And that is the version that you will hear on the radio almost exclusively. So you will not hear the version that is sung on in the White Christmas film, where he's sort of using his pipe to hit the bells and all of that. That's not the version you're going to hear on the radio. It's going to be the 1947 version. Also, what's interesting is that even though this is the Holiday Inn soundtrack, White Christmas does not appear on it. So it's in the movie, it's not on this, and there was actually a different track that they were trying to promote at the time that they expected to be a hit, and that was the track Be Careful, It's My Heart. So not a Christmas song, and obviously most of the music on this, despite the fact that you see all the snow on here on this cover, most of this is not Christmas music. In fact, I don't know if any of it is. It doesn't look like it. I mean, you could say that Happy Holiday perhaps is is probably the closest thing. So anyway, I think everybody needs to own a copy of, a record that includes Bing Crosby's White Christmas, and that is the reason why I have this copy right here. The next one is called Adventure in Carols by Ferrante and Teicher. Ferrante? I think that's right. It's not Ferrante, right? It's Ferrante and Teicher. Anyway, Adventure in Carols. This is from 1956 on the Westminster label. I think if any of these that I'm going to cover, well, maybe there's one other that is probably unfamiliar to most folks. This would be anyway one of those. The Discogs listing actually for this classifies it under three categories. So those are easy listening, space age, and experimental. And I actually believe that that's pretty appropriate for this particular title. So there's sort of a delicateness, right, with how the piano is played, some of the piano strings that are used. There's these sort of clinky, high-pitched notes that give it this really great feeling, and it's sort of hard to describe. I think that maybe the best way to think about it is that this is the perfect music to be sitting in a dark room with like only Christmas lights lighting the room, sipping on like hot cocoa or something like that, or a hot toddy or whatever, and just kind of like chilling out and listening to this, because it does sort of take you to a different place, despite the fact that it's Ferrante and Teicher, and despite the fact that it's from 1956. But highly recommend this one. Unfortunately, I think a lot of folks share my enthusiasm for this, at least a lot of collectors, because it can be difficult to find this title. However, I would encourage everyone to check the Christmas boxes, check the easy listening boxes, check the dollar bins, because most of the time when a record store, when a seller sees Ferrante and Teicher, they're going to file it away in one of those sections and only charge $1, unless they got wise to the popularity of this particular album and looked it up on Discogs. So anyway, keep an eye out for this one. Here's perhaps an obvious choice. This is by Nat King Cole, titled The Christmas Song. This particular album is a reissue from 1962. Now, I'm generally speaking a first pressing sort of fundamentalist. The original release of this came out in 1960, and it was called The Magic of Christmas. The reason why I intentionally did not get the original title is because that original one doesn't have any version of the song that this is named for, the Christmas song. And for me, that is Nat King Cole's greatest work. I just absolutely love that song, and so I wanted an edition of Nat King Cole's Christmas music that had it on it. What they did was they took that original album, they took off God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, they added on the Christmas song, which had been re-recorded in, I think, the same year of this release, and they stuck it on here. So if you want that sort of, in my opinion, classic song, and you like Nat King Cole, then this version and this cover version is the one to look for. Okay, this next one, definitely one of my favorites. You have a Ramsey Lewis trio with The Sound of Christmas. This is on the Argo label. It's from 1961. It says that there's a trio. There's actually a number of stringed instruments on this as well, but there are just some absolutely, sort of classic choices here in terms of the lineup. You do have the Christmas song. You do have a version of God Rest You Merry Gentlemen. Santa Claus is Coming to Town. Here Comes Santa Claus. A lot of these are sort of the, fun, fun tracks versus perhaps the sort of overly religious ones. But this is still, in my opinion, really great stuff and hits the right mood. I think that sometimes there's a tendency for stuff to be a little bit too loud, maybe too much sort of soul jazz. And this is definitely one of the more mellower ones, which is more of the music, I suppose, that I appreciate. So I do enjoy this one quite a bit. The next one is also from 1961, and that is by Charles Brown, obviously not to be confused with Charlie Brown. And this is Please Come Home for Christmas. This particular album is a reissue as well. This is from 1978. It is on Gusto Records. And I don't have any excuses to offer in terms of why I don't own the original. I actually think that there's a couple of additional tracks by Bill Doggett here. The original was put out in 1961, and it is called Charles Brown Sings Christmas Songs, I believe. So they changed the name of the album here in order to highlight that classic tune. I think everybody probably knows Please Come Home for Christmas. If anything, it feels like that song has increased in popularity. I feel like I've heard more and more singers cover this original Charles Brown track. So anyway, that is another great one as well. One thing that I want to mention that's in chronology, since that's 1961, and we're kind of moving forward, but I'm not going to show because it's not a Christmas album, is Bill Evans' Trio 64. So you may be familiar with that one. I think Acoustic Sounds reissued it quite recently, but it is called Bill Evans' Trio 64, sort of a white gatefold cover on the Verve label. And the reason why I want to mention that is that none of the tracks are Christmas related except for one, and that is titled Santa Claus is Coming to Town. So it is interesting that even in some of these jazz musicians' standard sort of non-Christmas albums, sometimes you get these little Christmas songs hidden in the lineup, hidden in the track listing, and that is one example of an album that has it, and it's a particularly great rendition. I mean, obviously anything Bill Evans does is going to be great. All right, this next one may be familiar for those of you who have watched all of my videos, but if not, I recently attended the Atlanta Record Convention. One of the albums that I picked up for $5 was the incredible Jimmy Smith on Verve. So this is titled Christmas 64. So this is entirely a Christmas album. You may be familiar with this title in terms of its other alternate cover, which came out the following year, which is, I think it's called What's Cookin'. Is that right? I think it's something called like What's Cookin' on that reissue, but it's Jimmy Smith in a car. It's a cool cover, but I believe that this is the original one. A lot of great tracks here. This is a large format though. There's like over 20 musicians on this thing, so it is not just sort of Jimmy Smith in a trio format. There's a ton of folks here. The next one that I wanted to talk about is Bobby Timmons' Holiday Soul. So conversely, this is quite the small format. I believe it is just a trio, not even a bongos player, right? Yeah, so just a trio here. This is on Prestige from 1965. You have Rudy Van Gelder behind the engineering, so it sounds great. Butch Warren and Walter Perkins join Bobby Timmons. And one thing that I find interesting, I suppose, is the types of songs, I suppose, that were maybe particularly popular that would be often used on these Christmas albums. So between these two records, you have you have White Christmas, the Christmas song, Santa Claus is Coming to Town, We Three Kings on each of them. So they came out around the same time. They're recording a lot of the same music, but again, very, very different because you have the large format with Jimmy Smith, and you have the very sort of stripped down format with Bobby Timmons. Here's another that you probably aren't aware of, or maybe you are, I don't know, I don't want to assume. But this one is called The Sounds of Christmas. So it features Dorothy Ashby on harp, Jimmy Clark on celesta, and Tom Montgomery on the organ. A lot of folks will get excited about seeing Dorothy Ashby on any album, really, because most of her stuff is so hard to get. This is not sort of soul jazz. It is not spiritual jazz. This is pretty straight ahead stuff, pretty pared down, pretty quiet. I came upon this at some point and I sort of got drawn in by Dorothy Ashby's appearance on it, and it is great music. But just keep in mind, it isn't like anything else that she put out. I'm also uncertain on exactly when this came out, what year. I want to say it was 1965 or so, at some point in the mid-60s anyway. But this is another that may go under the radar because it isn't jazz. You may see it in sort of classical sections, or you may see that folks just kind of gloss over the fact that Dorothy Ashby happens to be on it because there isn't otherwise a obvious leader here. So yeah, I mean, here it is, and keep an eye out for this one. This next one is my favorite of the bunch. However, because I've covered it before, actually pretty lengthy video on it, I'm only going to say a few words about it. So Vince Guaraldi, A Charlie Brown Christmas. This is on Fantasy from 1965. Great album. I think everybody is aware of this record at this point. I recently did a sort of shootout video comparison of the original stereo edition and the Kraft Recordings reissue that I think is, what do they call it, like the definitive version or something like that, where it has all this additional content, maybe deluxe version. Highly suggest you check that video out if you're interested in owning a copy and want to know which copy to get. I'll drop a link to that video in the description, but that one just holds a special place in my heart and the hearts of many, I think. All right, so moving along, Kenny Burrell, Have Yourself a Soulful Little Christmas. This is on Cadet. It is from 1966. This is one of those records that can be had for $15 or $20 every month of the year except for December, and it goes up to like $100. So it's really funny how that works. It's like people don't have it on their radar. So perhaps now is not the time to go seek out a copy, but you know, it's possible that folks haven't adjusted their prices and you can actually go find this. When you see Kenny Burrell leading a session, at least when I see Kenny Burrell leading a session, I want it to be a relatively small format. That's not the case here. So this is arranged and conducted by Richard Evans. It is a big group. Kenny Burrell is definitely featured, so he isn't like buried in dozens and dozens of musicians. But I would say that, you know, it's certainly a larger group. There's some good tracks on here, though. I mean, you have a version of White Christmas, God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, again, the Christmas song, right? Like, so a lot of familiar stuff is going to be featured on this album. Okay, next up, The Magic of Christmas by the Soulful Strings. So this has a few things in common with that Kenny Burrell title I just talked about. This is also arranged and conducted by Richard Evans, who is sort of the founder of the Soulful Strings. Similar to that record on tab, you also have Dorothy Ashby here. I would say that she isn't front and center by any means. There's quite the large group on this album. This is sort of jazz adjacent, I would say. It isn't specifically jazz. It is more of what sort of the Soulful Strings might suggest. But you have, I'm trying to think who you have featured here. You have Bobby Christian. I mentioned Dorothy Ashby. You have Phil Upchurch. You have a number of great folks, and then you also just have a ton of studio musicians who make up this lineup. Cleveland Eaton's on this one as well. But you know, again, you have great tracks on here. Well, I mean, let's see. You have the Christmas song again, right? I mean, there's obviously the same tracks are going to come up on these records fairly frequently. It's not like the Christmas music catalog, I suppose, at least in terms of the non-religious stuff, is that extensive. But I still find it interesting that just the same versions, or the same songs keep appearing on so many of these albums. And if anything, it kind of gives you an opportunity to sort of compare different renditions of it, which is which can be fun. Okay, so the last one that I want to talk about was recently reissued by Blue Note. This happens to be an original, but it is Merry Old Soul by Duke Pearson. The shrink is still on this, so there may be a little bit of a glare. Apologize for that. This is on the Blue Note label, the only one I'm talking about today that's on Blue Note. 1969. You have Bob Cranshaw and Mickey Roker on this one. Duke Pearson actually plays Celesta as well as piano. I find this album to be, I keep saying, like, I've probably said a few others are my favorites. Certainly the Vince Guaraldi title is my favorite, but this is right at the top, I think, right near the top in terms of my sort of preferred Christmas albums, and especially in the sort of the jazz, like strictly jazz space. It's just great stuff. Duke Pearson is, you know, I think was quite underrated. He was the A&R man for Blue Note. He was a talent scout. He produced a number of sessions. His fingerprint is all over their 60s stuff, the label's 60s stuff, and he had some great stuff on his own in the late 50s and well into the 60s. So I really love this one. 1969, this is the last one we're talking about, so I guess we kind of swung from, what was it, like 1954, 55 to 1969. I know that there's great stuff in the 70s as well, but I just kind of wanted to cover a dozen here, which actually, in retrospect, 12 days of Christmas maybe, I don't know. So anyway, hope this was interesting for you. I'm interested in your thoughts, both in terms of like, what are your favorite Christmas albums? What speaks to you? Because I know that my choices aren't going to speak to everyone, right? Everybody has their own sort of, music that they're nostalgic for. Like I said, I do enjoy a lot of the sort of the crooners, vocal heavy sort of albums by Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, etc. But I haven't necessarily bought them all on vinyl because they aren't exactly my favorite versions of some of these classic songs. Trying to think who else Perry Como, Burrell Ives. I mean, I love all that stuff, right? And anything that was put out in that time period, I'm gonna love. But these are the ones that I have on vinyl, some of my favorites. Please let me know what your favorites are, especially if they're jazz. If they're instrumental jazz stuff and I didn't mention them, I want to know, because I want to know what I should be listening to, because I don't bust this stuff out except in December, and usually only like the last couple of weeks of December, because I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to overplay some of this music. But I'm certainly interested in broadening or expanding my horizons in terms of this genre. So as always, thanks very much. Please hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.